Hello, my name is Dan Ackers, and I write The Adaptive Human. Those who've been reading for a while will likely know some of this story. If you're new here, this might be a good place to start. For most of my life, I feel like I've been running away from or running to put out fires, different fires in my life. First, it was about running away from my problems after my parents' divorce. I adapted to my situation and avoided dealing with my feelings until I couldn't anymore. Then I moved to another city and started studying computer science at the university. I adapted and became a hyperactive student, both in classes and in student life. Then I launched a summer project, which later turned into a company. I adapted and became a CEO. For a while, that felt right, until it didn't. I started feeling like something was off, and eventually stepped down, handing over the position to a co-founder. We kept working on the company, though, from another position, and along the way, I got married and I became a father. From the outside, much of my life looked very successful. Even you could say is very successful, and in many ways, it genuinely was. But there are also periods where I felt increasingly disconnected from myself and who I believed I was, and I couldn't explain why. Nothing was obviously wrong. Everything looked fine, and I think that's part of what made my feelings so difficult to understand. Something underneath didn't quite feel right. Over time, I started noticing that many of the most important struggles people carry are often difficult to talk about because they don't really have clear names. The career that no longer fits, even though it looks good on paper, the identity you've outgrown, or the relationship change you can't explain. The feeling that something is off, even when everyone around you thinks you're doing fine or even great. When experiences or feelings don't have names, we tend to assume the problem is ourselves. At least I did. I remember thinking I was ungrateful for a while. And then I remember thinking I was confused. I mean, perhaps I even was broken or just failed to appreciate what I already had. What changed in my life wasn't really finding a perfect answer. It was realizing that what I had been struggling with wasn't unique to me, that there are other people who's been carrying similar feelings. And once I realized this, I became interested in trying to describe those experiences. Not because I've solved them or that because I have answers, but because, for me at least, there's something powerful about seeing a feeling clearly enough to name it. And that's eventually what led to the adaptive human. Writing became the way I explored those questions. For a long time, essays felt like the best format for what I was trying to do. They gave me room to explore ideas slowly and carefully. But over time, I started noticing that some thoughts needed a different kind of space. Not everything wanted to be a polished essay. Some ideas or observations are still forming, and as such are better explored out loud. Some questions become more interesting when I allow myself to stay with them a little longer instead of rushing toward an answer. And I want the podcast to be an extension of the writing, just spoken instead of written. And the reason for that is simple. The questions I'm interested in rarely have neat answers. They're the kind of questions that are often easier to explore rather than to solve. I'm not particularly interested in telling or teaching people how to live or how to win at life. Enough people are doing that. What interests me is understanding what it feels like to be a human while we're still in the middle of it. The uncertainty, the adaptations we make, the things we carry long after everyone else thinks we've moved on, where life continues normally on the outside while something quieter unfolds beneath. That's what this publication is about. But I'm trying to understand those moments a little better. So if you've ever felt like your life was functioning while something inside felt off, or if you've ever looked at your life which made sense on paper yet still feels like something's missing, then you're probably in the right place. Thank you for listening, and I'm glad you're here.